They expected that the neighbor, Tatus, that he'd be down. He went rushing off the balcony up there, and it surprised Violet a good bit. She thought, boy, he really must have been hoping for an invitation to be coming that fast, and so they were kind of expecting him to show up. Well, of course, he wasn't he wasn't coming down. Instead, he was sitting there thinking, what should he do? He was in his world. So he didn't show up right away. So they thought, well, let's practice walking. Let's try it with this walker that I got. She'd got, I don't know if I told you, she'd got a walker at the same yard sale with the wheelchair, and for almost nothing. Well, Lance did his best, but he couldn't go far. And both of the women were watching him because he was liable to fall. He would have been okay if his shoulders were both okay, but his right shoulder was not okay. Of course, his knee wasn't. But he was doing the best he could, and he could actually go a little ways. And he managed to get sort of to the far corner of that little paradise that she had behind her house. And they stopped there for a minute, and Violet said, look over there. And underneath the bird feeder, which was back closer to the house, underneath the bird feeder, there, she said, I'll put it in her terms, she said, there's Muscles, the rat. Do you see him? And sure enough, there below the bird feeder, there was this big rat. And she said, oh, I'm so glad to see him. I hadn't seen him for several days, and I wondered if something had got him. But he looks healthy as ever. Lance thought that was a little bit surprising, but that's the way Violet was. Well, anyway, they got back, headed back. Well, they were going along with the wheelchair behind him because they thought he might all of a sudden have to sit down. But he made it back to the table area, which was in the middle, and he managed to sit down there and relax a little bit. And Violet said, would you like another Brahma? And he said, well, sure, that's really great beer. And she said, well, good. Elaine said, well, I'll get it. And she went in and got it and came back one for each of them, actually. And Elaine explained that I might as well get used to doing this because I'm starting a new job tomorrow. Tomorrow's Friday, if I have this right. Yeah, I think I have that right. And Friday night she was going to start a new job, and she was going to be working in a sort of a beer hall. I'll explain about that later. But she'd be serving beer, so she thought, well, this will be practice. And she came back, and Lance said, boy, that's really good beer. And it kind of loosened him up a little bit, as beer has a tendency to do. And his mind was clear. He started to tell the stories in more detail about his bicycle ride from Seattle all the way to Richland. Well, except for that part that he couldn't for the life of him remember at the end. But he explained about how, they went over mountain passes and it was just so cold. And then they'd come down onto the plain and it would be so hot. I mean, this was August. And when at one point he was saying that they were riding along, or he was riding along, and there was a sandy area to turn, and his bike slipped and he fell. But he didn't really get hurt. But what was surprising was that this Mexican-looking guy all of a sudden appeared out of the woods, an old guy that came over and checked him to see if he was okay, and when he got up and it was clearly he was okay, guy disappeared back into the woods. Didn't know anything else about him. Well, Don, his buddy that was doing this with him, he'd noticed that Lance wasn't in the rearview mirror, and so he turned around and he came back and found him. So anyway, that was an adventure, and I already told you about the windmills and the feedlots. Man, he was really surprised at them, how you could smell them miles before you got near these feedlots. And you know, a lot of it was a little bit tedious, but they were doing it. And he said that it was kind of strange that there was a woman that was just such a wonderful hostess in West Virginia, I think it was. Might have been Tennessee, but I think it was, or I get those states mixed up. I think it was West Virginia, and her name was Violet, and people called her Vi. And she was actually sort of world renowned as a wonderful hostess to bicyclists that were making this journey. So he was really talking. And now Elaine loved this, because just like she had that savant gift, I guess I'd call it, where she remembered, well, I've explained it already, she remembered tunes, she remembered poems if they got her attention. Well, she was the same way about stories. She couldn't get enough stories, really, and her mind, I don't know if you ever heard somebody say she had a mind like a tar bucket, which meant that if something went into that mind, it stuck. And that's the way she was about stories. And so she was marveling at these adventures, and also being quite impressed with Lance. I mean, there's no hiding it. I mean, he was kind of getting to be a hero in her eyes. So that was all very nice, and they were time for another Brahma. Thought now they were big beers too, but Violet offered, and she said, "We're going to drink this up pretty fast here, because you know this is very expensive beer, but I'm ashamed, and it's delicious, but it's imported all the way from Brazil, and have you ever heard? I'm kind of ashamed that I bought it in a way as good as it is, but I just had I wish to taste that Brazilian beer again." But she said, and Lance says, "Ashamed? Why would you be ashamed if you could afford it?" And she says, "Well, did you ever hear of what they call now food miles?" And Lance said, "No, never heard of that." And she said, "That's odd, because what did you study in college?" And she said, "Well, I studied sustainability studies. I was going to be an architect, but Wedge talked me out of that. Sustainability studies." And Violet said, "Well, didn't they say anything about food miles?" And he said, "No, it was never even mentioned." She says, "Well, that's so strange, because the food that people eat, so much of it in the United States, so much of it is shipped from so far away. So you take a guy, a worst case really would be, say, somebody who drinks imported French wine. I mean, can you imagine how much diesel fuel is in that bottle of wine? That's a funny way to look at it." She said, "I know, but it took a lot of diesel fuel or jet fuel to get that bottle of French wine onto a table, and the same's true of Brahma. So I'm not going to buy it anymore, but I saved this last for a special occasion." And I might as well tell you now too that today, well, is it okay, Elaine? She goes, Elaine says, "Sure, I don't mind." Today is Elaine's birthday. She just turned 18. And that's the reason she can start her job tomorrow. And Lance said, "Were you going to just let that go by?" And Elaine spoke up. She says, "Yes. As a matter of fact, I don't like to even think about it. We don't make a fuss about that kind of thing. Not in this family. I mean, the worst for us, the worst of all, is something like Mother's Day. You know, my mother, before she died, I remember that she used to say that that was just such a way to get people to buy stuff. All of them were to get people to buy stuff they didn't really need and feel guilty if they didn't. So we saw past that. So anyway, we don't make a big deal of it, and please don't you either. True, I've turned 18, but so what?